It's Fake Andy Warhol's 15 Minutes. In Theory. Episode 2. Amnesiac vs. Kid A, and when Bernie wanted to ban television. Other topics include Gilles Deleuze, the Enlightenment, and of course Chris Chan.
I'm wondering if I could get a man in, if I could get a man in with a little lower profile. Ladies and gentlemen, certainly a man who needs no introduction anywhere, of course, in the greater New York area and certainly around the country watching at this point in time. We saw you earlier, Andy Warhol. Your impressions of what took place earlier on here?
Oh, I'm speechless.
Well, you've got to be. I mean, so many. I mean, I saw jaws drop to the floor.
It's just so exciting. I just don't know what to say.
Have you ever seen such total bedlam and pandemonium in your entire life?
Never.
Your impressions of the rock and wrestling connection. Don't you think that they got together tonight here and band together and stood on firm ground?
It's the best I've ever seen in my whole life. Most exciting thing.
Well, I'll tell you what, I thank you very much, Andy Warhol. I thank you very much for joining us. Good luck. And one of the greatest wrestling fans, always a pleasure seeing you here at Madison Square Garden. Good luck to you. I thank you.
I'm gonna leave this party now. I'm gonna leave this party now.
Special thanks to our new sponsors, KB Toys and Sam Goody. Follow Fake Andy Warhol on Instagram and buy my Warhol Chris Chan book on Amazon. Present your Instagram follower list and a copy of the book at any Sam Goody or KB Toys location for a free $1,000 shopping spree. Offer void in Hawaii, the Republic of Georgia, and the United Arab Emirates.
Now it's time for listener questions. K1 2.0 asks, favorite movie and favorite porn star?
My favorite movie's Citizen Kane, and has been ever since I was 16 or 18 or something. I've said previously that I consider film to be an evil art form, but Citizen Kane, I would say, might be my favorite work of art of any sort. I think it's almost completely perfect. There's one transition shot that I don't like. There's a transition shot where there's some sort of bird, parrot maybe, that screeches and then flies across the screen. That I think that's awkward, but aside from that one brief transitional shot, I think it's completely perfect. My other favorite movies would be The Trial by Orson Welles, 8½, and Inland Empire. I think Inland Empire is David Lynch's best work. And when I was a kid, I liked Gremlins and even more so Gremlins 2. For favorite porn star, I don't really have a favorite porn star, but if I have to choose one, it would be Lua Saturni. I did a series of Warhol-style portraits of her last year. She was on Instagram, and I think her handle was IdealXGF's Return. And I became aware of her because she was a model for a clothing company that I bought a shirt from called Dustrial. And she seemed cool, and what she posted on her own account was pretty funny. So I communicated with her and then got the okay to do a few portraits of her. But I think that ended up hurting me because she was like an activist too. Her account got taken down, and because I was connected to her and a few other people, I think that put my account on like a sporadic shadow ban list where sometimes my account does not have the reach that it should have, and it's extremely odd. It's like Instagram is choosing random days to like throttle me or something. And I think it's because I was connected to a few people that were banned. But I didn't ever see any of Louis Attorney's porn. But yeah, I'll give it to her.
We're gonna find KB toy store. We're gonna see KB. We're gonna find KB toy store. Come take a look and see. Under a rock? Under the moon?
The place to find the KB Toy Store is at your local shopping mall, where you'll find great toys like Hasbro's G.I. Joe Mobile Strike Force, the Joes with the most advanced equipment.
We're gonna find KB.
At the Westridge Mall.
Next question. Curtis Jackson asks, is Deleuze actually worth reading? Assuming you've read him?
For anybody who doesn't know, this refers to Gilles Deleuze, who was a French postmodern philosopher who, I think he passed away in like 1995 or so. He jumped out a window to commit suicide. Yeah, I've read all of these postmodernists in the early 2000s, probably from 2000 to 2003. I read probably 6 to 12 books each from all these French postmodernists. Deleuze was among my favorites. I liked Baudrillard too. So my favorite French postmodernist would either be Baudrillard or Deleuze, and I have a positive view of Deleuze, but probably most of what I'm going to say here is just to criticize him and be a jerk. Okay, well, most of all, I like the taste that Deleuze has in artwork, and I suppose by extension, the taste that his oft-writing partner, Felix Guattari, has too, because the artists and the authors and the works that they cite in their works, they tend to be things that I like also. Deleuze on his own wrote a book on Kafka towards a minor literature, which is very good. And he also wrote a book, Proust and Signs, and Proust and Kafka are probably my two favorite authors. In their work, Deleuze and Guattari also reference James Joyce, Samuel Beckett, and those are other authors that I like. So they're into the same things that I am, but I find a lot of Deleuze's ideas specious, and especially when he's writing with Guattari, I think they do such a horrible job of presenting and explaining their concepts that I have to wonder whether or not they did such a bad job of it in order to provoke a lot of other people to write about them. Sort of like how fake Baudrillard will make an Instagram post that is like provocative but incomplete and kind of being a jerk slightly. And he knows that that's going to get interactions. That's going to get people in the comments arguing, and that helps the algorithm. To me, it seems like that's what fake Baudrillard does sometimes. And it seems to me that a lot of these French postmodernists, especially Deleuze and Guattari, it's almost like they do things on purpose to provoke other people to try to explain them. And the two main works that Deleuze and Guattari did, Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus, I like both of the books. You know, if you have a lot of extra time, yeah, read them. I don't know why you would read them instead of reading Freud, but I mean, they're fun works to read, but they're laid out very poorly. I think sort of like the artistic flourishes that they have in their writing, and sort of the way that they structure it is not very good. I don't know what the fuck in 1,000 Plateaus, why they have chapters that are like from the dates. Like one chapter will be called like 10,000 years BC, and another chapter will be like 1912 or something. Then I think there's a chapter that's like year 0, and they're all out of order, and it's a mess. And it's fun to read. I mean, I like literature that's hard to read, but I don't really see where the difficulty can be resolved in a way that's all that meaningful. I don't think that some of their concepts are as applicable to the contemporary situation, or whatever you want to call it, as they would have you think, and as a lot of their fans just assume that they are. Although I think that the names of their concepts are extremely interesting, like the body without organs, or like desiring machines, or like, what is it, lines of flight or lines of escape. But in particular, those first two, I don't think that the body without organs concept is actually that interesting or explanatory. I don't think that the desiring machines concept is that interesting once you understand it, or explanatory. I just don't. And people argue on and on and on about what the concepts actually mean because they're laid out so incredibly poorly. But when you find out exactly what they're trying to say, the concepts actually seem to mean less than you might think from just hearing about them at first. So if you're going to read like philosophy or psychology that has concepts that are not really exactly true, then why not read Sigmund Freud? Sigmund Freud is the greatest myth maker and the greatest writer of fiction of the 20th century. So just read Sigmund Freud. Freud is a great writer. There's problems here and there with how they translated certain words, keywords of his, like id and ego. But no matter what translation of Freud you can find, it's worth reading. So if the argument against Freud is that his concepts were not exactly true, well, I don't see how Deleuze's concepts are any more real. I mean, Deleuze is pretty far out there, and he writes well overall, not when he introduces concepts, but when he's like analyzing art or a psychoanalytical situation, he's good. He's a good writer. But I guess what my criticism is that it seems like a lot of Deleuze fans, like a lot of online internet philosopher fans, it's like they're looking for the answer, capital T, capital A. They're looking for the answer, and they're looking for heroes, and they find a hero and they want their hero to beat somebody else's hero. And I mean, I think Deleuze is worth reading if you have the time, but I don't know why you'd read him if you haven't read Sigmund Freud. I mean, Deleuze has a lot to offer, and I don't really want to go here, but a lot of his work just seems to like be justifying dysfunction. He's not as much of a culprit at this as more recent people are, but I would really caution you against throwing yourself wholesale into Deleuze, because we see where it ends. A lot of the ideas that Deleuze has are interesting ideas, good ideas. I think he tried to push in the right direction, often arguing for more horizontal structurings like the rhizome, but hierarchies exist whether you like it or not. And if you're going to try to like change things into a horizontal rhizomatic structuring, then the forces that are trying to do that will themselves become upper echelons of the hierarchy. And I'm not saying anything that a lot of the postmodernists themselves haven't thought of. Like, they've thought of all of these potential criticisms of their work, but a lot of what I see is that people just throw themselves wholesale into whatever Deleuze, for example, seems to say on the surface level of his work. And I don't know what the fuck the point is of any of that. I mean, you may not like hierarchy, but it persists. You may not like the Oedipus complex, but the Oedipus complex, or something very close to it, keeps showing up again and again throughout much of humanity. So it's not like you can just say the Oedipus complex or something like it hasn't existed, because it has. But yeah, overall, I have a positive view of Gilles Deleuze. I'm just constantly baffled, kind of, that he seems to be as popular or as memeable as he is. Overall, I like him, but read Freud first. Also, I'm not an expert on Deleuze or French postmodernism. I haven't reread a lot of it since I read it the first time nearly 20 years ago. So I'm sure that people who are more familiar with the text could nitpick what I said. Yeah, but that's the impression that I have. And I do not think that really it's worth rereading these texts too awful much unless you're going to be a philosophy professor, in which case, yeah, okay, I mean, this is what you need to do.
Next question. Trash Comics asks, last podcast you mentioned that the Enlightenment was more disastrous than the Industrial Revolution. What are some of the main issues that you see with the Enlightenment that make it so?
Well, the Industrial Revolution may be more directly harmful, but the Enlightenment ideas fueled it and make the outcomes worse and persist even as industrialism itself declines some in certain societal quadrants. My main problem with the Enlightenment is that it was very hubristic. The Renaissance was sort of a rediscovery, and then the Enlightenment was sort of an arrogant jumping to conclusions that we can do it better. So it seems to have started a lot of radical utopianistic reforms sort of under the vanguard of, quote, logic. And even if the resultant rationalisms lead to illogical or irrational outcomes and programs, I mean, I'm not a huge expert on this book either, although I read it once, but just look at Horkheimer and Adorno's book, Dialectic of Enlightenment, and their criticisms of the Enlightenment, particularly positivism. I think that they're on target there. But whereas Horkheimer and Adorno sort of stopped their criticism at the place where they saw excessive rationality taking hold of society, I think now, close to 100 years afterwards, we see sort of new superstitions that are reinforced on the ground levels by thought programs that were started by the Enlightenment. So while for humans on an individual level, we think that we're being logical and rational often, and we put our faith and trust in Enlightenment instituted rationality, overall, as the technological society has expanded, it's resulted in a very illogical, irrational situation. But overall, my criticism of the Enlightenment and what I would point toward would be the sort of inherent hubris in a lot of what it did, in a lot of what it instituted. I mean, basically saying that continuity can be wholly overdone, overhauled, and that human beings can pretty much control the universe.
Lion of Panjshir writes, Chris Chan. Nothing else, no real question. They just wrote, Chris Chan.
Yeah, people are always wanting me to talk about Chris Chan. What I will say here is to point toward a sort of parallel between Chris being arrested and Warhol being shot. When Warhol was shot in 1968, that was the event that really skyrocketed his fame. That was where he made the cover of a lot of newspapers. And even though he was known prior to that, that was the event that made him the premier pop artist of all time. Everyone knew that from that point on, he was synonymous with pop art. Even if his prices weren't always the highest, he was number one. And with Chris Chan, Chris was famous prior to the incident of a few months ago. But you look at Google Trends and Chris's popularity just skyrocketed when that happened. And as we've seen, because of that, there were articles in newspapers all over the world. I think Tucker Carlson talked about it. So the arrest will be seen as the event that secured Chris's place in history or infamy. Even though prior to that, sure, Chris Chan was extremely well known in certain quadrants. Prior to the arrest, prior to the crime, to the publicity, Chris Chan was already known as the lolcow of lolcows. That's what I called him in the book, and I don't think I was the first person to say that. If I was, then I'm sure other people would have already thought the same thing. But after the arrest, after the crime, after the resultant publicity, there's no doubt whatsoever that Chris Chan is the number one representative of internet celebrity, with all the concomitant craziness and upheaval that it entails. And I think it's also worth noting that in the aftermath of the shooting, Warhol had himself photographed with his shirt off so that his scars from the shooting would be shown. There is a famous series of these photographs taken by Richard Avedon, who's a famous photographer. And it's obvious, and critics have noted this, that the look Warhol's going for is Christ with the stigmata. His wounds from the shooting are made to seem as if they're Christ's wounds on the cross. And now we hear that Chris Chan is identifying with Jesus Christ in jail. And apparently Chris even signed the return address to a letter as Jesus, first name Jesus, Chris Chan Sonichu. So the Jesus identification in Chris's case is obviously far more direct than the sort of wink that Warhol was going for. And yet, after the shooting, Warhol and those around him did sort of cultivate this idea that Warhol was Jesus of the underground art scene, that the dirty, grimy, sometimes horrible people that Warhol hung out with, he was their Christ. He would, in a sense, redeem them through his art or through his divine presence. It's a blasphemous idea, especially for Warhol, who was in a sense, strict Catholic. Now, Chris used to be a follower, supposedly, of Jesus Christ, and is now superseding Warhol in this respect by making a more direct comparison. And I don't think that it's right. I mean, if I were Chris, the only reason I would do this would be to try to mount an insanity defense. But I don't know. I don't think that's what Chris is doing. And overall, I think that it's bad. It certainly provides another mostly parallel line of comparison between Warhol and Chris Chan. But just as a human, I don't like this. I think Chris should repent, basically, for a lot at this point. And we'll see how the trial turns out or what defense Chris's lawyer makes. And also, there's been a long-standing idea that really Warhol brought the shooting on himself by hanging out with so many weird and deranged people. But in a more practical sense, Warhol didn't tell Valery Solanas to shoot him, obviously. But there's been sort of a question over the degree of responsibility that Warhol takes for his being shot. And in a somewhat similar way, people are wondering how much responsibility Chris Chan should take for the incest. If Chris's mind is really confused, and if there was this troll, this woman from Texas, I think, student, who had gotten Chris's trust and was encouraging Chris to do the incest, how much is Chris to blame for the transgressions? It's a question. I think Chris is to blame, and I've seen a few Anons make comments along the lines of, how could a third party trick someone into incest? And well, in Chris Chan's situation, it's at least a question because of the state of Chris's mind. Prior to this happening, we all knew Chris was crazy, but I don't think many of us, and I certainly didn't think that Chris would ever do something harmful like this, and it's a real shame that it happened. Not that Chris was ever an angel, but in the same way, I think Andy Warhol at times was a real asshole, was a real jerk, was really irresponsible, but I don't think Warhol should have been shot.
Next question. Audie11 asks, would Giles Chatlet like Fortnite?
I haven't read anything by him, and I've never played Fortnite.
Last question. Slouching towards Gamora asks, would Jacques Ellul like Kid A?
I'm not sure. I believe that he possibly could have appreciated some of the beauty of the album and perhaps would have been intrigued by the themes of alienation, but I can't really imagine Jacques Ellul listening to Radiohead. But that brings us to the first main segment of this episode. Radiohead's Kid A album came out in October 2000. This was a 3-year gap between albums. Their previous was OK Computer, which was rightfully hailed as a masterpiece. And 25 years ago, most bands put out an album every other year. When I was growing up, when I was a teenager, that was the usual thing. Every now and then, a band would put out an album in subsequent years, but usually it was every other year. The fact that it was taking Radiohead so long to release a new album really drummed up hype and a lot of intrigue. I was a freshman in college when it came out, and what I remember most from that period was just the excitement and the interest of it seeming like there could be a new art movement even from this album. That's how much people were anticipating it and how much they were willing to sort of bet the future on it. It was unlike OK Computer, as probably everyone listening understands this already, but it was comparatively experimental, abstract, at times ambient, and the critical acclaim was gigantic. I remember at the time, my girlfriend was really into Radiohead. That was the band that she liked most, which probably explains her depression. And they were playing in Roseland Ballroom, and the show was sold out. But what I did was I somehow contacted the woman who was in charge of press for Roselands, and I pretended to be a music critic from Amazon.com. Now, this is not a complete lie, because anyone can review anything on Amazon.com as a product review, and I had reviewed albums. So, I was a music critic on Amazon, but I made it seem to her like I was Amazon.com's music critic, and I forged an identification card with the Amazon logo on it to make it seem as if I was an Amazon employee. And the woman bought it, and she got me into the sold-out show, and I pulled it off. I used this experience to write an essay for my nonfiction writing class at the time. So that was fun. The show was okay. But I much preferred Radiohead's next album, Amnesiac, which was released the following year in May 2001. Even though the material from both albums was recorded in the same sessions, critics much preferred Kid A. Kid A was looked at as this watershed moment, and Amnesiac was perceived as if the songs were a bunch of B-sides. Now, I like Amnesiac much more, and what I'm going to do is review every track from both albums and then make my case with some closing thoughts afterwards. I have to say, at first, up front, if you like Kid A more, fine, I don't care. I'm not saying you should be in a concentration camp if you think Kid A is the superior album. I mean, you might have to go, if I was in charge, you might have to go to a re-education camp for 6 to 8 weeks until you get your head straight, but it's not like I think you need to be permanently in a concentration camp if you don't think Amnesiac is the better album, which it is. By far.
Kid A, Track 1, Everything in Its Right Place.
This is a strong opening track. I like the impressionistic lyrics. Ultimately, we get right into the mold of songs that seem to mean more than they actually do, though, because this song doesn't really say anything, but it seems to aspire to say something. And just overtly, the idea that everything's in its right place is a good starting point if you're going to delve into alienation. And yet ultimately, the concept seems wrong-footed because how could the authorial voice think that in the first place? It's not as if the album is about the world falling apart from a safe place. It's not about chaos upending order. It seems to be more about meandering alienation. So, just on the face of it, as pretty as the song is, the idea of it is ultimately discordant with the rest of the piece, the rest of the album.
Track 2, Kid A.
This is just meandering ambience. I'll quote Genius.com, who likes the song, but they say, while some of the lyrics make clear references to literature and politics, it is unlikely that Tom intended for the song itself to carry a clear intellectual meaning. Well, yeah, and yet it has the pretension of intellectualism, which is the problem. But even if you remove that problem or you don't think it's a problem, I don't find this very interesting. It's pleasant enough, but nothing special. It seems like a sort of tone poem. Pointless, not particularly beautiful, innovative, or interesting. Not bad, but nothing special whatsoever.
Track 3, The National Anthem.
This has a good groove. It's strident, but to what end? It sort of provokes a provocative stance, but then doesn't say anything. And that sort of anticlimax is not particularly impressive.
Track 4, How to Disappear Completely.
Float down the left
Alright, well, this is a 4-star song minimum. It's solid, beautiful, haunting, ghost-like, emotionally resonant, somber, and yet there's a hint of something that makes me think it's a pose, it's an act, it's fake. There's the slightest twinge of that. But overall, I mean, this is a fantastic song, obviously. I might give it 4.5 stars out of 5.
Track 5, Tree Fingers.
This is good. This is nice. Nothing particularly special. Listen to any Brian Eno instrumental. Listen to any of the instrumentals from the Berlin trilogy of albums by David Bowie. those are better than this. This is okay, but once again, nothing particularly special as far as I'm concerned.
Track 6, Optimistic.
The big fish eat the little ones.
This is the one that they turned into a single for the radio stations, and at the time, there was a lot of hoopla saying, what song on Kid A could they possibly make a single of? It's so uncommercial. And this is a single. I mean, this is fine. This is good. But once again, nothing special. And I really have to say that the people who were into this album who thought that it was uncommercial, they sort of liked thinking that when really this is fine. This is nothing hard to get into. And when you read criticism of this track, they talk about how it's a critique of consumerism or of capitalism because of the line, big fish eat the little ones. And perhaps Tom York meant for an anti-capitalist idea to come through with that. But I mean, this is nature. Big fish eat the little ones describes nature itself. And yet we have all these people, including Tom York probably, who just overlook the basic facts of life and leap to these very flimsy and I would say under-informed critiques. So if you're complaining about exploitation, the first thing to understand is that it's a feature of nature itself. Not that that excuses injustice, but the point is that there's an underlying broader truth that it seems Tom York here and many others simply are unaware of. There's the Animal Farm reference in here too, and I interpret that as just a pseudo-profound provocation. There's nothing behind it, but name drop George Orwell, and there seems to be some meaning there, when really there's nothing to explore. Genius.com, or some site that I wrote down this quote from, says, dinosaurs roaming the earth may be a positive phenomenon. Maybe dinosaurs sound wistfully prehistoric to Tom, unquote. And yeah, there's nothing to really think about other than these pointless hypotheses about authorial intent. And maybe we shouldn't ask these questions and just enjoy the music. But the lyrics keep trying to make us think that something profound is being said. And there isn't, really. I wish there was, but there isn't. Well, it sounds like I'm being really mean. I think it's a good, solid 3-star song. Nothing particularly good about it. I like the ending sort of jazz riff.
Track 7, In Limbo.
Trapdoors that open, I spiral down.
Well, this one's better. Not great, but I would say this is at least a 3.5-star track, maybe 4. Somewhat interesting, yeah. I like the lyrics of trapdoors and I spiral down. Sets a good mood. Sets a sort of pleasingly disorienting experience.
Track 8, Idiotech.
This is really happening. Will not scare.
Well, this is the best song on the album. Probably the best song across both albums. This is a masterpiece. 4.5 stars, probably 5. I mean, this is great. This is really good. I don't have a lot to say. It's a masterpiece. The way that he chants Ice Age Coming sums up the entire Chili album. We have the sense that it's chilly because of a technologized environment. I love the refrain of "We're not scaremongering," and when he says, "This is really happening," it reminds me of a line in the movie Rosemary's Baby. I'm sure Tom didn't intend for this. It's just, it's a relatively commonplace phrase. This is really happening. But there's a moment in Rosemary's Baby where she's having a dream, or she thinks it's a dream, and she's being raped by a demon or by Satan. And then midway through, she comes to the realization that this isn't a dream, this is really happening. And the line in this song always reminds me of that moment from the film. But no, the instrumentation, the rhythms, this is great. Did a great job with this one. Masterpiece.
Track 9, Morning Bell.
This song provides an obvious point of comparison with Amnesiac, because Amnesiac has a version of this song too. This version on Kid A is anodyne, mild-mannered. The Amnesiac version is much more interesting. It sounds beleaguered, deranged, and aware of a dire situation. This version on Kid A is bland. Not horrible, but bland, especially by comparison.
Track 10, Motion Picture Soundtrack.
Supposedly this song was written years earlier during the sessions for Pablo Honey, and the reception of this song tells us a lot about context. I don't think this song is without its minor charms. I like the rhyme of crazy and maybe. I like the way those lines are sung. I like the line, "I will see you in the next life" at the end. And yet, this is a boring song. This was written earlier, and it shows. I think if this song was included on Pablo Honey, even as the last track, I think critics and many listeners would find it uninspired and a bit trite. I don't think that it's bad. I think that it's kind of boring. It's a little pretty, but it's mostly boring. It's the most boring song on the album. But because it's the last real track on Kid A, listeners are compelled to experience it as, in some sense, profound and as more moving than I think that it actually is. And it's this manufactured profundity that explains a lot of my misgivings about this album.
Track 11.
And then as a sort of bonus track, we get this nice little pointless ambience. It doesn't hypnotize, it doesn't break any spell, it's just pointless ambience. If you stream this album online or purchase MP3 copies of it, I don't think that the spacing comes through, but originally on the first release, the first physical release, this hidden track came after 60 seconds of silence, and then afterwards there is another 60 seconds of silence. Why would you put 60 seconds of silence again at the end? It's another bit of pretentiousness, in my opinion. Not fun, not clever. It would be different if the album were playing other sorts of games, other sorts of formal jokes on the listener, but it's not. It would be funny if Frank Zappa or someone like that, who was often clowning around, included 60 seconds of silence after a hidden track, but that's not Radiohead. It seems pointless and pretentious.
Amnesiac. Track 1, Packed Like Sardines in a Crushed Tin Box.
After years of waiting, I'm always on my case.
More discordant sounds make for more interesting listening. After years of waiting, nothing came. That line is a great opener. I'm a reasonable man, get off my case. That line is more memorable to me than any lyrics on Kid A. The lyrics here do not provoke pointlessly. They don't mean anything more than they suggest, and the words work well with the sounds. If anything, this track is a touch too long, but it's quite solid.
Track 2, Pyramid Song.
This is the single that they went with for this album, or at least the lead single. I don't know if they had two. I don't like this song. This might be my least favorite song across both albums. It's aimless, too long, boring. Boring.
Track 3, Poke Pull Revolving Doors.
This is abstract and actually avant-garde. I love the list of the different types of doors in the lyrics. Trap doors, opening doors, revolving doors. I love that. Great, abstract, very good, very good.
Track 4, You and Whose Army.
Holy Roman Empire.
I would compare this to the national anthem on Kid A. And You and Whose Army, I find more strident, even in its quietude, which is interesting. It seems to say that even at this weakness, the protagonist is disarming, confident, subversive, dangerous. This is an excellent track. It's everything that the national anthem is not, and it beats the national anthem at its own game in an interesting way. This is a wonderful song. 4.5 stars.
Track 5, I Might Be Wrong.
I don't care what the words are. The vocals and the sounds play well together. There's a better groove than almost anything on Kid A. The lyrics are abstract, like a mix of Dada and nursery rhymes, which is a sort of technique that Radiohead went for, and this is one of their earliest best attempts at it. The outro to this song is actually disorienting and beautiful. And there again, something on Amnesiac seems to master and fulfill what Kid A only attempted.
Track 6, Knives Out.
Knives Out is more menacing and profound, with a sense of loss and disorientation than anything on Kid A, and it achieves this with mood, comprehensible lyrics, and relatively traditional instrumentation. So yet another clear banger in Amnesiac's favor.
Track 7, Morning Bell.
We already went over this somewhat, but yeah, the version here on Amnesiac is more disorienting. It sounds beleaguered, like we know what our bad situation is, and yet it still retains beauty. So much more interesting than the Kid A version. Anthony Fantano criticized this track by saying the Amnesiac version sounds like we walked into the song a third of the way through or something. And yes, it does, but that's just so much more interesting. Otherwise, to hear this song played straightforwardly, pleasantly, in full, as it is on Kid A, is just a very boring experience.
Track 8, Dollars and Cents.
This is not particularly great, but it does a fine job of creating a oral environment, and there is something vaguely interesting in the franticness, which is more than I could say for most of what's on Kid A. I'm a bit ambivalent about the "we are the dollars and cents" line. It's not particularly egregious, but it is another example of someone being more hung up on capitalism when there are deeper drives.
Track 9. Hunting Bears.
This is a far more interesting and unique instrumental than anything on Kid A. I like the slide guitar. This serves a purpose, is a great bridge between songs. It's not instrumental ambience for the sake of instrumental ambience, as on Kid A.
Track 10. Like Spinning Plates.
This is actually experimental. I like the backwards loops and sequencing or whatever is going on here. This is an interesting listening experience. You just sit and space out to this. The reference to the body floating down the river seems to bookend the line in How to Disappear Completely about floating down the Liffey. Just a great, beautiful track here. Perfectly positioned towards the end of the album when everything's climaxing.
Track 11. Life in a Glass House.
There's someone listening.
This is a great closer. The more or less traditional instrumentals are shown to achieve and surpass the same disorienting, melancholy feel of the weird electronic bleeps and bloops that we've heard previously, which it really goes to show that though the mood of this song and the mood of the previous song, like Spinning Plates, I would say they complement each other quite well. And yet, like Spinning Plates is the most experimental, the most artificial, Life in a Glass House is the most real, the most traditional in its instrumentals. The last line, there's someone listening, seems to weld surveillance paranoia with the listener himself or herself, where at the end, we are the one listening in. And that's a nice little closing twist. Whether Tom York meant it or not doesn't really matter. The whole song's beautiful, the words are great, and the lines are particularly interesting in all sorts of ways.
Closing thoughts.
In the year 2000, when I impersonated an Amazon music critic to get into the Radiohead concert, I said that I also used the experience to write an essay for my nonfiction writing class. In that essay, I also briefly reviewed Kid A, and even at the time, I expressed my disconcertion at the hyperbolic praise that the album was receiving. I remember writing that the supposed artistic breakthroughs that Radiohead were being given credit for had already sort of been done in the 1970s by David Bowie in his Berlin trilogy of albums, Low, Heroes, and The Lodger. With those more somber, experimental, instrumental albums, Bowie subverted expectations and arrived at new aesthetics by fusing his sensibility with those of Brian Eno, who produced most of the tracks on those albums, as well as krautrock influences such as Kraftwerk, Neu, and Faust. I didn't see anything noteworthy on Kid A that hadn't, in a sense, already been explored by David Bowie, Brian Eno, or the krautrock artists. I would also add that if a lot of the instrumentals or instrumentations on Kid A were on random Aphex Twin albums, no one would care. And if anything, those tracks would seem like lesser offerings from Aphex Twin. That's not to say that I think Kid A is a bad album. I would give it either 3 or 3.5 stars. And I would give Amnesiac either 4 or 4.5. So I'm not arguing that one album is perfect and the other one's horrible, but I am arguing for the difference between the two. Certain critics rag on Amnesiac because they say the songs feel incomplete. I like the incompleteness. The incompleteness allows the listener's mind to explore the songs, and the missing pieces allow us to put our consciousness into them. On the other hand, the tracks of Kid A may sound more complete, but because of that, they seem anodyne. Their icy sheen is superficial. The music site Pitchfork wrote that Kid A challenged and confounded Radiohead's audience, but at the time, and I was there, all the Radiohead fans that I knew in real life and on the internet loved the album. They had to like it or they wouldn't think they were cool. Radiohead was cool. There was a cool sheen to this album. You had to like it. And for the other people that weren't preconditioned to already accept whatever Radiohead came out with, well, those people were supposedly the profane because they didn't get Kid A. As if Kid A was inaccessible, as if it was a really difficult album, when it's not. It's not at all. It's not that complicated. Pitchfork also writes that Kid A transformed into an intellectual symbol of sorts. Owning it became getting it. Getting it became anointing it. And yeah, but there's nothing intellectual on this album. Perhaps I would call it pseudo-intellectual, but it doesn't even qualify for that. It's just mostly boring. And in a sense, it's a badge, though. It's a token. It wants to be non-commercial, but it's still a commodity. It functions the same way. It's, once again, like the trap that Kurt Cobain fell into, not wanting to be a pop star. Well, Kid A doesn't want to be an alternative rock album, and yet it is an alternative rock album. It won Best Album at the Grammys for alternative rock. It wants to pretend that it's an experimental album, but the experimentation is quite meager. Most of its praise, or a good deal of its praise, comes from sources that want to seem smart, that want to seem avant-garde. What should matter more is what things really are, what our perceptions, what our sensibilities, what our artistries actually are, not what they pretend to be for marketing purposes, even as they take cheap and predictable shots against commercialism. Amnesiac isn't a perfect album, but it offers more actual innovation and experimentation, and there's less pretense. There are no overt references, cheap references to George Orwell. Kid A is more influential and has probably had a more positive influence than Amnesiac, simply because Kid A is blasted out everywhere. And flawed as the album is, I can certainly see that it's done some good. But I like Amnesiac more. I liken Kid A to Baby's first experimental album. When 50 Cent's Get Rich or Die Trying came out, myself and a few others, I don't remember who named it or coined the phrase first, but we called it Baby's first gangsta rap album because Get Rich or Die Trying was very well produced, very well put together, very by the numbers, and it wasn't a bad album, but it was a very predictable album, and it certainly attracted a new large audience that wasn't exactly into gangsta rap prior to that. And I look at Kid A in much the same way. In the year 2000, most of the people that liked Kid A hadn't listened to David Bowie's Berlin trilogy, or much of Brian Eno, if any, and they certainly wouldn't know about Faust. And there's nothing wrong with that. If this is the album that introduced lots of people into sorts of sounds that they hadn't ever heard much before, that's fine. But it's not a great example of innovation or experimentation in rock-oriented music. So if Get Rich or Die Trying is the most generic gangsta rap album, then Kid A is the most generic experimental album. How can something be generic and experimental at the same time? Well, Kid A is your answer. Kid A is generic, but somewhat experimental. I much prefer the honesty and the lack of pretense in Amnesiac. When Amnesiac has a song about opening and closing doors, revolving doors, there doesn't need to be anything more. That's avant-garde. And Amnesiac is put together in such a particular way that the closing song, as I said, uses traditional instruments to achieve the epitome of unease and alienation that the more experimental productions had been trying to do over the course of 2 albums. In this way, it is as if Radiohead shows us that the more natural, traditional, and human can supersede technology, and therefore the real sense of unease that we get ultimately comes from ourselves and from our own psychology. That's what makes us human. In the end, there's someone listening, and it's the government, or it's the techno authority, or it's the more human experience of someone listening to the music that you've made. It's all the same, and the sense of unease is ultimately created within the person being surveilled themselves. This final idea at the end of Amnesiac says more than the entirety of Kid A, and it says it in a beautiful, traditional arrangement.
Goody, 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 goody. Goody got it, goody got it. Sam Goody got it, Sam Goody got it, Sam Goody, Sam Goody got it.
We've got it. Summer savings at Sam Goody. Pick up Theater of Pain from Motley Crue, Invasion of Your Privacy, new from Rat, and Shaken and Stirred by Robert Plant. On sale now, only $6.99 each. Store-wide summer savings at Sam Goody.
Goody, goody, Sam Goody got it, goody, goody. Sam Goody got it, Sam Goody got it.
Sam Goody. Got it.
Second feature segment of the show. The Bernie Sanders discussion.
Okay, I sort of spun things for dramatic effect when I said that Bernie wanted to ban TV. What he wanted to do actually was have the public take over commercial television, which is not quite the same thing. But when he was trying to do this in his arguments, he attacked the nature of television in ways that I find quite appropriate. Now, this material, I first became aware of it from a 2016 Yahoo News article entitled Bernie Sanders' Radical Past, How the Vermont Firebrand Started Wearing a Suit and Gave Up Taking Over Big Companies, from early 2016. So if you want to find that article, just search for the title that I said. Now, probably this article came out to paint Sanders as a goofy guy. The first half of the article talks about how he wanted the government to seize the wealth of the Rockefeller family, who he describes as the wealthiest family in the world. I'm not sure if that was or is exactly right. I don't think it is. And I'm actually more sympathetic for these wild ideas than you might think, even if the sum total of the Rockefeller family would not amount to much of an increase if you spread it out over the entire population. I just like the idea of seizing all of the Rockefellers' wealth. I like that idea. The second half of this, this article mentions ideas that Sanders had in the 1970s. So this article drudges up what it thinks are kooky ideas. And the second half of the article talks about Sanders' opinions on television as stated in a 1979 editorial that he wrote for the Vermont Vanguard Press entitled Social Control and the Tube. So what I've done is I've extracted a large quote from the Yahoo News article that regurgitates this information, and I've also set aside some quotes directly from the original 1979 editorial. So I'm just going to read them now, and then I will offer my opinions. So this is from the Yahoo News article. The editorial, titled Social Control and the Tube, called for people to, quote, address the control of television as a political issue and organize to win. Sanders argued the owners of commercial television stations sought to, quote, intentionally brainwash people into submission and helplessness, unquote, through, quote, constant advertising interruptions and the well-tested Hitlerian principle that people should be treated as morons and bombarded over and over again with the same simple phrases and ideas, end quote. He said the television industry was designed to, quote, create a nation of morons who will faithfully go out and buy this or that product, vote for this or that candidate, and faithfully work for their employers for as low a wage as possible. Sanders suggested a public takeover of the airwaves could remedy the problem. Quote, the potential of television, democratically owned and controlled by the people, is literally beyond comprehension because it is such a relatively new medium and we have no experience with it under democratic control. At the least, with the present state of technology, we could have a choice of dozens of channels of commercial-free TV, he wrote, adding, quote, at the moment, serious writers are, by and large, not allowed to write for commercial television for fear they might produce something that is true and hence upsetting to the owners of the media. Under democratic control, people with all kinds of views could make their presentations, and serious artists would be encouraged to produce work for the tube, unquote. All right, that's the end of what the Yahoo News article quoted. Now I'm going to read some quotes directly from Sanders' 1979 article. Quote, a recent study has indicated that the scholastic aptitude test results of high school students has declined precipitously over the last decade. Teachers throughout the country complain that many of their students are unable to read or concentrate for any length of time on a concept. Next quote. Not too surprisingly, given the nature of the medical and psychiatric establishments, very little attention has been given to the psychological damage that constant advertising interruptions have on the capacity of a human being to think. If one is watching an hour-long program of whatever kind, and one's thought pattern is interrupted 20 or 30 times within an hour by totally separate concepts such as talking cars, feeling free with Coke and Pepsi, improving your sex life with close-up toothpaste, getting relief from hemorrhoids, donating money to wipe out cancer, doing away with bodily odors, getting whiter washes, etc., etc., etc. What happens to the ability of the mind to think, to concentrate, to analyze? Could one conceive of a serious program, something which reflects real life and is produced in order to have an impact on people, being interrupted every 7 minutes by moronic commercials? Obviously not. People would be totally incensed, just as they would be if they were involved in a serious conversation, which was constantly interrupted by extraneous noise. And at the end, lastly, I actually do have one more quote from the Yahoo News article that says, Sanders had a chance to pursue public control of television broadcasting, as well as his fight against utility companies when he became mayor of Burlington, Vermont in March of 1981. But evidently he didn't do that, I guess. Yeah, I'm pretty sure he didn't do that. Okay, so what do I think of all this? Well, first of all, this is the Bernie Sanders that I like. I wish that this 1970s Bernie Sanders was the Bernie Sanders that was in the media for the last 6 or 7 years, because I think that what this Bernie Sanders is addressing, even if he may not have an answer, is more connected to the real problems and the real experiences that people have. What he's talking about is how people are unable to think or concentrate, and it's somehow due to technology. And he's talking about how the forces of the media have more power over the people than the people can handle. That in the current situation, the people are like more or less helpless prey to an overwhelming onslaught of media technology. And he was writing this in the 1970s when the tip of the spear at the time was just broadcast television. So you can imagine what that 1970s Bernie Sanders would think if he could see the media landscape of today. But the Bernie Sanders of today does not really speak about these things at all. He just sits there 2 election cycles in a row where the DNC robbed him both times, but I'm not going to get into this. Anyway, what the problems that I see or the areas that 1970s Bernie Sanders just didn't think about would be as follows. The first would be the canard of education through television. Reading between the lines and reading the entirety of the article, it seems as though 1970s Bernie Sanders wants the apparatus of the television to sort of educate the masses. Now, I've never really heard of anyone getting smart by watching television, and I'm not, that cannot affect someone's intelligence. It just can't. It can give you factoids that maybe you can do something with, but overall, the medium itself, it doesn't really work well for education. I would point toward the author Neil Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, and the research that he did. And what he showed in that book is that what educational television teaches us how to do is how to watch TV. Like, what does educational TV teach? It teaches how to watch TV. No matter, the medium is the message. Not that the content is completely irrelevant, but the content is a distant cry from the potency and the effect of the medium itself. And this holds true whether you're talking about commercial television or non-commercial television. Neil Postman analyzed not just cartoons for kids, but PBS too. And there's a large amount of data on Sesame Street in particular, for example, that shows that this show did not really teach kids much of anything, that the kids who watched Sesame Street did not come out ahead, and that actually, in certain cases, and the people behind Sesame Street were aware of this phenomenon, that sometimes the kids would actually know less and do less well on the same material after watching Sesame Street, try to teach them about it. In other words, Sesame Street, through the medium of television, had the disorienting effect of making children know less, even as it was trying to teach them more. And within Bernie's argument, you also see this flawed idea of more technology is the answer. He senses that there's a problem that seems to be stemming from a technology, and his answer is, well, turn the technology loose to everybody. Well, we see from the proliferation of YouTube and social media, which is quite close to letting the public have their say over the airwaves, that this has not sorted things out. Now, there's a censorship angle too, of course, but even without that, it obviously was not getting humanity back on track even before the censorship cranked up. I wish the censorship wasn't there as much as it is, but it's not like things would be sorted out if censorship wasn't going on. It's a disorienting cacophony, and when everyone is a content creator, and everyone is a content creator now, it's a disorienting cacophony. And in the end, of course, what 1970s Bernie Sanders is hammering on about is the capitalistic aspect. He's very concerned with advertising, with the effect of advertisements on people. But what he doesn't quite seem to realize is that every message is like an advertisement. Whether it's a direct advertisement or not, the effect is that everything is an ersatz lifestyle advertisement. The things that we mention, the ideas, the icons, the concepts, it all functions as advertising, whether it's intended to function as a simplistic advertisement or not. Andy Warhol kind of gets into this too when you think about so many of the paintings that he did, they look like advertisements. Well, every icon is an advertisement. And yeah, the capitalistic aspect certainly made many of these trends worse, but you can remove it and most of the disorientation remains. You can have consumerism without capitalism. Elsewhere in this article, in the Yahoo article, when he talks about seizing the Rockefeller family's wealth, he talks about how the money should be, quote, used to create a decent standard of living for all people. Like I said earlier, I don't know how much everyone's net worth would rise if the billionaire's wealth were seized and given to everyone. I mean, we get a few $1,000s each more, but what he doesn't seem to understand is that capitalism itself has had the effect of raising most people's standard of living exponentially in service of technology. Now, from a lot of what I've said, you might claim that I'm anti-technology. Technology has improved people's lives. The Industrial Revolution has helped a lot of people. People like the effect of this. The problem is that ultimately there's a hollowing out of the human soul, and eventually it seems that technology will lead to an extinction of the human race even. At the current moment, we can see that more indirectly than directly, technology has a detrimental effect on human psychology. The challenge would be, and there may not be an answer, would be to come to terms with how technology has improved our standard of living, and it has done so by means of capitalism quite often, paired with the concern of the increasingly artificial situations that we find ourselves in, which leads to depression and disorientation. So just the simplistic idea of turn the airwaves over to the people somehow. In the article, Bernie Sanders admits that he doesn't even exactly know how this would be accomplished. But just this idea of let everyone broadcast their thoughts and ideas constantly isn't the solution. We've seen that. It's just leading to more chaos. But I think this is a really interesting article nonetheless. And I would be in favor of just completely banning television. On one of these episodes, I might go into this book. It's from the 70s. I don't think Bernie Sanders was aware of it. I wish that he was. It's called 4 Arguments for the Elimination of Television by Jerry Mander, which is his actual name. And he talks about how the introduction of television into relatively isolated Native American communities in the 1970s just instantly wiped away the community's heritage and changed their way of life. And it wasn't just because of the advertising. It was because of the medium itself and the effect of seeing and hearing images and voices of people that weren't actually there. But that's for another time, and I'm aware that we could never ban television, we could never ban film, we could probably never seize the Rockefellers' wealth, but I'm just in favor of seeing what effect those sorts of initiatives would have. When the pandemic started over a year and a half ago, I really liked that the professional sports leagues shut down. Not because I hate sports or anything. I like to watch the NHL. But I think that taking away these major components, these sorts of relatively frivolous and yet obsessive activity, would perhaps be beneficial, if only so that we can see what humanity at this stage would even do without them. It would be interesting to see how we would go on without being able to watch professional sports or read about them online. It would be interesting to see what we would do if we couldn't pass so many hours watching movies or television. I would just like to see, just as an experiment, I would really like to see.
We have some late-breaking thoughts and ruminations from the listener known as lerripunc. Larry says,
a big problem is how derivative everything is. Think about how Tarantino made movies that were kind of derivative of older art, and how now Tarantino has a status as a classic director and people try to imitate him, or how most artists, while very skilled, focus on making fan art. Their ambition is working for Blizzard or other companies as character designers. We're still piggybacking on stuff like Frankenstein, James Bond, Superman, etc., and everything became less iconic by the decade.
From a certain point of view, the lack of originality isn't a bad thing. In more traditional cultures, folk tales and mythologies were told and retold and slightly changed over the years, over the centuries even. So I don't think it's a problem that stories and particularly movies keep being remade. The problem comes into it because these are copyrighted properties that studios have control over. So the ersatz cultural mythologies and culture heroes are not necessarily changing in ways that the people and the culture themselves are receptive to. They're being either misused or artificially manipulated in order to affect the audience that seems like they'll see them no matter what. That's not to say that changes to iconography through the ages weren't made in top-down fashions, processes at certain times. That's not to say that prior to copyright laws, all art and all culture was free or anything. But now copyright and trademark laws have been extended and extended and extended. And the culture that's repeating itself is not only artificial, but it's not only artificial in the sense that it's made by more and more technology, but artificial in the sense that it doesn't have to play to an audience.
Larry continues.
What type of art do you think would be a step forward?
I would be careful about framing things in terms of a step forward. I would say that the main point of art should be to glorify the universe or the culture or humanity or God even, not to necessarily lead an audience or prod an audience. And perhaps the problem isn't so much with art, but with our ability to sense our existence as one that's worth celebrating and portraying in art. And the way life has gone for a lot of us, the last few years especially, it's understandably difficult if we don't feel predisposed to celebrate or glorify existence, but we should. And even within tragic art or subversive art, which are obviously viable forms of art, there will be an appreciation for human perception, human condition, in a sense that creation is worthwhile. So ultimately, the point of our creations is to reflect the greatness of all of creation. And when that sense of appreciation has become stultified, we begin to question the point of art itself, when the point is nearly self-evident.
The museum's most important holdings aren't necessarily the artworks, but the extensive archives. These include 600 of Warhol's time capsules, boxes and boxes filled with the detritus of each working month at the factory.
It's all worth saving. It almost sounds like Jesus. They're all worth saving, right?